Sweden and Finland have both announced that they are considering joining NATO. This has made the headlines amid the war in Ukraine, especially given that part of Russia's reason for attacking Ukraine was to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. Some individuals, particularly among Western political circles, are claiming that this is a strategic defeat for Russia, since Russia went to war with one country to prevent it from joining NATO, and as a direct result, two more countries are now talking about applying for NATO membership. However, to say that this is any sort of strategic defeat for Russia is, at best, a gross exaggeration. And these are the reasons as to exactly why. First of all, we need to understand that there is something that is called NATO membership, and then there is de facto NATO membership. And both Finland and Sweden are de facto NATO members. That is to say, they primarily purchase and use NATO weapons, especially in the case of Finland, which uses almost exclusively US manufactured equipment for its air force. The Swedish military closely cooperates and regularly conducts joint exercises with NATO. Both are members of the European Union, which is incredibly closely aligned with the United States and is, for all practical intents and purposes, just another sub-organization within NATO. And as a direct result, the political leadership in both of these countries is heavily aligned with NATO. Now, this is nothing new. This has been the case since the end of the Cold War, and especially in the case of Sweden. It has been the case since NATO was first created. In fact, the bitter anti-Russian sentiment in Sweden goes all the way back to the wars that were fought between Russia and Sweden all the way back during the 18th century. So for all practical intents and purposes, both of these countries were already de facto NATO member states for quite some time. And I should note that the same was and still is true for Ukraine. And because of this, it can be concluded that Russia does not lose so much politically by having two more NATO member states on its borders. These countries were already de facto a part of the NATO alliance. So it's not as if Russia has made any new enemies. These enemies were already present for quite some time, especially in the case of Sweden. However, and especially in the case of Finland specifically, which shares a large border with Russia near Russia's historic capital of St. Petersburg, this carries a very significant security risk for Russia going into the future. Perhaps not one as great as if Ukraine were to join NATO, given that Ukraine is a much larger country, a post-Soviet republic, and one that has a much larger military than both of these Nordic countries combined, not to mention a large population which identifies itself with Russia and which would be a moral defeat for Russia for them to be a part of NATO. But the simple fact that Finland's border lies so close to St. Petersburg, which is a metropolis of around 6 million people, is a major threat to Russia's military security, and this was in fact the reason for which the Winter War was fought. Back then, the fact that the border between St. Petersburg, or as it was known back then, Leningrad, lay within artillery reach of the Soviet-Finnish border, and it was clear that a major war was going to happen in Europe within the next few years, was simply unacceptable to the Soviet leadership. And this is why, back then, the border was changed by military means through having a war, so that Russia's historic capital city, what many call Russia's second capital, could not be attacked, captured, or shelled by any opposing army so easily. But of course, that was 80 years ago, and modern fighting equipment has advanced a lot since then. Modern artillery can still reach St. Petersburg from the Russian-Finnish border, and this is an especially grave threat now since we have the concept of nuclear artillery. Not to mention the fact that if there was a large NATO garrison near this border, that NATO garrison could push into Russian territory near Russia's second capital very easily. And from here, Russia has two choices that it can pursue. It can either fortify its border with Finland and Sweden, or it can try to dissuade Finland and Sweden from joining NATO. Now, I have to say this, I do not think that the second one is an option. The decision to make Finland join NATO is clearly already made. And most interesting is the fact that this decision is not made in Finland itself. It was made in NATO, in the European Union, in Brussels. Most interesting and most notable is the fact that even as we are being told that most Finnish people want their country to join NATO, we are also being told by the Finnish government that there isn't going to be a referendum on this matter. And we're also being told that the ratification process for Finland to formally join NATO may be concluded as early as this summer, in other words, in only a few months. And this, if anything, is a very clear indicator as to how closely Finland is already integrated into NATO. It is already a de facto NATO country and has been such for quite some time. And given NATO's long history of expansionism, given the fact that we have seen 5 enlargements of NATO since the Cold War ended, as opposed to only 3 during the entire course of the Cold War, given this precedent, it is safe to say that even if there was no war in Ukraine, both of these countries would have still joined NATO just at a later date. So that leaves Russia with only one option, and that is to shore up its defenses on its borders with Finland and with Sweden. For NATO, this is undoubtedly a win, because even though the militaries of Finland and Sweden are in no way comparable to the militaries of Russia or even of Ukraine, for them, the fact that they will be able to use Finnish territory as a staging ground to prepare for an invasion or a bombardment of Russia is going to be a major military win. Although, as some other people on the internet have said, and as I concur, this is but a consolation prize compared to what would have happened if Ukraine had joined NATO. And one further point that I will add on top of this is that we are seeing the battle lines drawn for a new Cold War. However, in this Cold War, unlike the last one, Russia is not the one big superpower that collectively represents the entire Eastern Bloc of countries. Russia, of course, still is a major economic and military power, with the world's largest and arguably most advanced nuclear arsenal. And it is undoubtedly a superpower, but it is not the superpower. The superpower of the East is China. Russia plays a similar role in the Eastern camp as the United Kingdom did in the Western camp during the First Cold War. That is to say, a major world power with lots of global influence, and one which is clearly the second in command, so to speak, of its political bloc. So while this particular enlargement will do a lot to piss off Russia, and it will do a lot to threaten Russia's long-term security, in terms of global significance, this event is much less important. It is the equivalent of what would have happened if, hypothetically, the Soviet Union had placed its nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles not on Cuban territory to target the United States, but somewhere in perhaps Ireland to target the United Kingdom. In that hypothetical situation, the United Kingdom would of course be majorly pissed off at the Soviet Union, but ultimately the United States, which is the superpower of its bloc, would have barely been affected, and by extension, NATO and the collective West as a whole would not be affected that much. And what is happening with Finland and Sweden is basically just that, but in reverse. Russia is going to be majorly pissed off, it's going to feel more threatened on that front than before, but ultimately it's something that Russia will have to and will be able to deal with. But on the other hand, the other countries of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which by the way is rapidly turning into an anti-NATO bloc, are hardly going to be affected. However, one final point that I have to make about this is that Finland and Sweden, and especially Finland, is going to be enormously affected by this decision, and not in a good way. Finland became a prosperous country by remaining neutral. After the Second World War, after it had signed a peace agreement with the Soviet Union, Finland continued to trade with both the West and with the Soviet Union. And historically, the Soviet Union and then Russia has been one of Finland's largest trade partners. And one sign of Finland's increasing shift to the West is that even as Russia's economy grew over the last 10 to 15 years, Russia's share in Finland's imports and exports shrank. And this is largely because Finland signed onto the Western sanctions train. And this decision to sanction Russia, to join the European Union in its economic war against Russia, was as clear a sign as any that Finland is neither a neutral country nor an independent country, since the European Union imposed these sanctions as a whole, and Finland would not have been able to avoid them even if its political leadership wanted to. But much more disastrous than this is the decision to join NATO, and I am really trying to see this from Finland's perspective, but I just cannot see any reasoning. I cannot see how this benefits Finland or the Finnish people. Western media is of course trying to spin this as Finland wants to join NATO because it doesn't want Russia to do the same thing to Finland as what Russia is doing to Ukraine. But everything that Russia is doing to Ukraine isn't because Ukraine wasn't a part of NATO. It is exactly because Ukraine was already a de facto part of NATO. And on top of that, it is because of the systemic glorification and expansion of Nazi sub-organizations within the Ukrainian government. As I have mentioned before on this channel, numerous Nazi militias and organizations like C-14, Right Sector, Azov Battalion, or as it is called in Russia, Azov Brigade, are a part of the Ukrainian government and a part of the Ukrainian armed forces. In the case of Ukraine, these organizations carried out widespread massacres and killings of pro-Russian citizens and of ethnic Russians. The same simply isn't true for Finland. Nothing of the sort is happening in Finland. And you have to see this from Russia's perspective. Ukraine is historically Russian territory. The majority of Ukrainians speak Russian. Many of them have families in Russia, which they partly lost contact with when the USSR collapsed. And a good portion of Ukrainians, especially in eastern Ukraine, identify themselves with Russia over the current pro-NATO, pro-Western government in Kiev. But again, none of this is true for Finland. So even if we accept this image of Russia as being this expansionist, aggressive country, it still has no incentive to attack Finland. Because if Russia occupied Finland, then Finland to Russia would be nothing but a burden. A population that doesn't speak Russian, which doesn't share anything like the same history with Russia, and which doesn't have the same mentality or cultural values as Russians do, which at that point would mean that Finland would just become a problematic region for Russia, where everybody is against the Russian government. And of course, Russia wouldn't want to deal with that either, which is why Russia has no incentive to attack Finland, why it's not going to invade Finland in the same way that it invaded Ukraine. And if Finland really does feel threatened by Russia, the solution isn't to invite a military alliance that is hostile to Russia and to keep therefore provoking Russia even further. I will remind everybody that Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. Any provocations against Russia will not end well. The wise thing for Finland to do in this case, if it really did feel threatened by Russia, would be to try and reach for a collective security agreement with both Russia and the West. That is to say, a collective security treaty in which Finland would formally remain a neutral country and would not invite any foreign force onto its territory, but would side in a war with one of these blocs in the event that it is attacked by the other bloc. That would guarantee Finland's security, and it is also something that the Russians would undoubtedly accept over the idea of Finland joining NATO. And logically speaking, at that point, NATO would have to accept it as well, because from their perspective, if they didn't accept it, they would have to risk Finland militarily siding with Russia, which of course for them would be a big no-no. But given that we are living in a world and in a time where things are not run by reason or logic, all indicators point towards the fact that Finland is going to apply for NATO membership. And this is going to give NATO the ability to use Finland as a staging area, to place their nuclear weapons on Finnish territory, to position their brigades and divisions on Russia's border poised to strike Russia's northern capital. And in retaliation, Russia will place its brigades and divisions on the other side of the border, and these forces will be poised to strike Finland, including with nuclear weapons. So in the event of any kind of military clash, Finland risks being turned into a nuclear wasteland. The Finnish government and the Finnish military are overwhelmingly supportive of this decision. Meanwhile, the Finnish people aren't even getting a voice in the matter. And the collective West sees this as a big win, even though in reality, the collective militaries of both Finland and Sweden are absolutely tiny compared to the geopolitical significance and the military of Ukraine, which, by the way, is being absolutely demolished by Russia even as we speak. And of course, the collective West focuses on the little fish, which is Russia, more than on the big fish, which is China. And that is a strategy which is doomed to fail in this new Cold War. And that is all that I am going to say on this matter, at least for now. We might get more updates in the future, in which case I will undoubtedly cover this topic again. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my Telegram channel, as well as my Rumble channel. The links to both are in the video description. And if you are watching this on Rumble, again, Rumble is an amazing platform. It has no political censorship, and the links below will be to my YouTube and Telegram channels. And with that said, I wish you all a wonderful day.